The world says money is simple: earn, spend, save. But what if prosperity was never about money at all? Here we uncover the contradictions that shape how we think, act, and feel about wealth. Welcome to the Prosperity Paradox podcast, where every story challenges what you believe about success. This story begins with something so small, so ordinary, you'd almost miss it. A paper cup of coffee, still warm, still full, still perfectly good, and a man, Mark, standing at the corner of a busy street in early winter, his breath turning white in the cold air. He didn't plan to give anything that morning. He didn't wake up feeling generous. In fact, he'd been feeling the opposite: tight, anxious, worried about bills, work, life, all the usual weights that sit silently on a person's shoulders. But then he saw her, a woman sitting on the sidewalk with a torn backpack beside her, hugging her knees to stay warm. She wasn't asking for money. She didn't even look up. She just sat there, eyes half closed, as though she'd run out of strength long before the sun came up. Mark hesitated. He felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct to hold on, to protect, to keep what's his. He tried to walk past, but the coffee in his hand felt suddenly heavier, as if the cup itself was asking a question he didn't want to answer. And then, without thinking, he stopped. He didn't give money. He didn't say anything inspiring. He didn't solve anyone's life problems. He simply knelt down, placed the warm cup beside her, whispered, "This is for you," and walked away before she could reply. That was it, an action so inconsequential it shouldn't matter at all. And yet something shifted. He felt it halfway down the block, a curious looseness in his chest, as if the tight knot that had been there for weeks had quietly undone itself. His mind didn't understand it, but his body did. A strange warmth spread through him, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't pride. It wasn't relief. It was something deeper, a sense of enoughness, like a small voice rising from inside him saying, "You had more than you thought." That moment, the gift that shouldn't matter, was the beginning of a loop he didn't yet know existed. A loop that starts not with the wallet, but with the mind. Not with having more, but with realizing the story you tell yourself about what you have. But the paradox didn't reveal itself all at once, because just the night before, Mark had been sitting in his dimly lit apartment, staring at his bank app, feeling the familiar wave of scarcity wash over him. Rent was due, his car needed repairs, work was slow. He'd promised himself no extra spending, no generosity, no unnecessary giving. "Until I'm stable," he told himself, "until I have more." And so he held on, tight, always tight. It's funny how people who came from scarcity rarely realize they're still living inside it long after the crisis is over. Mark didn't grow up with much. His parents lived paycheck to paycheck, counting coins at the kitchen table. He learned early that money disappears fast, that generosity is a luxury for people who don't have to think twice. So he lived with invisible rules carved into his mind. Don't share, don't trust, don't let go, because if you lose what you have, you may never get it back. And for most of his adult life, he obeyed those rules without question, until this morning, until a cup of coffee changed something he couldn't quite describe. As he walked toward the subway station, he kept replaying the moment. The look on the woman's face, or rather, the way she didn't react. She didn't smile. She didn't thank him. She didn't even lift her head. And strangely, that made the feeling stronger. He hadn't given to receive anything. He hadn't given for approval or recognition. He'd given because in the smallest, quietest way, a part of him wanted to feel like someone who had enough to give. That was the paradox unfolding itself, gently. Like a curtain being pulled back in slow motion, we give because we have, but sometimes we only realize we have when we give. Mark reached the subway platform. People rushed around him, bundled in coats, headphones in, eyes down. The world moved fast, noisy, impatient. Yet inside him there was an unexpected stillness, as if the morning had cracked open a window in a room that had been sealed shut for years. He leaned against a cold metal pillar, closed his eyes, let the moment settle. Why did something so insignificant feel so meaningful? Money didn't change, his problems didn't disappear, his future didn't suddenly become secure. And yet something inside felt slightly, almost imperceptibly, lighter. He wondered if anyone else had ever felt this way. If generosity was less about the receiver and more about the giver's relationship with themselves. If giving at its core was a kind of message sent inward. I trust that I'll be okay. I trust that what I have is enough. I trust that life isn't a zero-sum game. But Mark wasn't ready to understand any of this yet. Not fully, not consciously. He only knew one thing. As the train roared into the station and cold air rushed past him, the heaviness he'd been carrying for months wasn't quite as heavy anymore. It was the smallest shift, a millimeter of movement inside the mind, but sometimes that's all it takes to start a transformation. A cup of coffee, a moment of hesitation, a decision made for no logical reason. That's how the loop begins, not with abundance, but with a whisper of it. And Mark had just heard that whisper for the first time. Scarcity doesn't shout. It doesn't slam doors or break windows. It moves quietly like a draft under the door, like a shadow in the corner of the room. Most people don't even notice when they're living inside it. Mark didn't. To him, being careful with money was simply common sense. Planning ahead was responsible, was saying no to dinners, to trips, to help, to invitations, to anything uncertain was smart. But beneath all those seemingly rational choices lived something older, more primitive, fear. Fear that the past could return at any moment. Fear that life could collapse the way it once did when he was young. He learned that fear early. When he was 9, he watched his parents argue over a late rent payment under the flickering kitchen light. His mother kept rubbing her forehead the way she always did when she tried not to cry. His father paced back and forth, muttering numbers like curses. Mark remembered thinking that money must be like air when it's gone. You suffocate. Later, when the electricity was cut for 2 days, his mother made it a fun game by lighting candles and telling stories. But Mark could see the worry in her smile, could feel her trembling when she tucked him in. Even as a child, he sensed the truth. This wasn't a game. They weren't pretending to be okay. They were pretending not to be drowning. Those memories, those quiet, heavy moments, don't disappear as we grow. They solidify into beliefs, invisible but powerful. There will never be enough. You have to hold on to everything you can. You can't trust life to provide for you. By the time Mark became an adult, those beliefs had woven themselves into the fabric of his behavior. He didn't buy things he wanted, even small things. He avoided risks. He turned down opportunities that required any upfront cost, emotional or financial. He never asked for help. He never offered it either. He thought he was being wise, thought he was avoiding instability, thought that caution was the same as safety. But scarcity has a strange way of hiding its true shape. It convinces you that you're protecting yourself when, in reality, you're building a cage bar by bar, thought by thought. Not because you're poor, but because you're afraid of becoming poor again. Not because you lack, but because you never learn to feel safe with what you have. And the cruel irony, people who fear losing often lose the most joy, connection, chance, growth. But none of this occurred to Mark. Not yet. He only saw the world through one lens. Hold on tighter. He held on to money, of course, but also to time, to comfort, to his routines, to his predictability, even to people not out of love but out of fear of being left. If you asked him whether he lived in scarcity, he would have laughed. He had a steady job, he paid his bills. He wasn't wealthy, but he wasn't struggling. And that's the thing about scarcity, it rarely reflects the size of your bank account. It reflects the size of your fear. Mark's fear was quiet, constant, always humming beneath the surface. He didn't talk about it, didn't even recognize it. But he felt it in the way he clenched his jaw when checking his bank balance, in the way he avoided opening mail with financial statements, in the way he woke up at 3 a.m. thinking about the future. Scarcity had become his worldview, and it seeped into all the small corners of his life. When colleagues asked him to join after-work drinks, he always said no, just trying to save money. But the real cost wasn't the price of a beer. It was the friendships he never built. When a co-worker needed help moving, he declined busy weekend. But the truth was, he didn't want to give his time away. It felt unsafe. When opportunities appeared, a night class, a small investment, a short trip, he turned them down instantly. To be responsible, he told himself. But the question he never asked was responsible to whom? Because the adult Mark was still obeying the fears of a 9-year-old boy. And that's the deepest paradox of scarcity. The more you let fear decide your actions, the smaller your world becomes. And the smaller your world becomes, the scarier everything outside it feels. A shrinking life creates shrinking choices, and shrinking choices create shrinking confidence. Mark had no idea how much of his life he'd traded away just to feel slightly safer. But that morning, after giving the woman on the street a cup of coffee, a small crack appeared in the walls of his cage. A hairline fracture, barely noticeable, but real. As he rode the subway to work, he kept replaying the moment, the impulse, the warmth he felt afterward. It made no logical sense. How could giving losing something make him feel bigger? He looked around the crowded train, the tired faces, the stiff postures, the unspoken heaviness that almost everyone carried. In that moment he realized that scarcity wasn't just his private prison, it was everywhere. In the man guarding his briefcase like someone might steal his entire life. In the woman scrolling through her bank app with a worried frown. In the couple arguing softly about a credit card bill. In the eyes of strangers who seemed to move through the city as if it were a battlefield. Scarcity had many forms: money, time, love, attention, but the emotion underneath was always the same: fear. And for the first time in a long while, Mark felt a tiny flicker of curiosity. What if there's another way to live? He didn't have the answer, only the question. But sometimes a question is enough to change the direction of a life. He stepped off the train with a strange feeling. Something invisible had shifted. He didn't know it yet, but the cage had begun to loosen, and the loop, the one that starts with giving, was waiting just around the corner. The strange thing about change is that it rarely announces itself. There's no thunder, no revelation, no dramatic music. Sometimes it's just a feeling, a softness, a quiet knock from inside the mind. Mark felt that knock the next morning. He woke up earlier than usual, not with anxiety the way he often did, but with a gentle alertness as though something inside him was awake before he was. He brewed coffee, sat by the window, and found himself thinking again about the woman on the street. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, didn't even know if she had accepted the cup. But he knew how he had felt after giving it. It lingered with him like a faint warmth on cold skin, and that puzzled him. Why would something that left him with less coffee, less money, less control, leave him feeling more? It made no sense. It defied the rules he lived by. It contradicted everything his childhood taught him. Giving should make you vulnerable. Giving should make you anxious. Giving should make you smaller. So why did he feel the opposite? He kept replaying the moment, the hesitation, the impulse, the quiet decision to kneel down beside her. He remembered how uncalculated it was, how unplanned, how unlike him. Most of his life had been spent protecting himself, preserving himself, planning every step. But that moment had bypassed all of that, a pure instinct, unfiltered by fear. And then came the warmth. A simple gesture had created a space inside him, like cracking open a window in a room that had been closed for too long. The air felt different. He felt different. He didn't know it yet, but this was the first step into what psychologists call the abundance mindset. Not magical thinking, not delusion, but the subtle inner belief, I will be okay. And that belief, even in its smallest form, changes the entire internal landscape. Because generosity isn't just an act, it's a signal, a quiet message you send to your subconscious. I'm not in danger. I have something to share. I trust there will be enough later. I don't need to grip everything with white knuckles. Fear doesn't like this message. It resists. It questions. It tries to make you regret giving. But Mark noticed something strange. Fear didn't speak as loudly after that gesture. It wasn't gone. Scars rarely vanish in a day, but it wasn't in control either. It felt muted. He went to work and found himself softer in conversations, more patient, more present. When a coworker spilled coffee on the floor, he helped clean it up without a sigh, something he normally would have avoided. When a colleague shared a personal worry, he listened without checking the time. None of these were dramatic changes, but they were changes nonetheless. And people sensed it. There is a quiet truth about human behavior. When you soften, life softens back. When you open, life opens too. At lunch, a co-worker he barely knew invited him to sit together. Normally, Mark would decline out of habit, out of discomfort, out of fear of small social risks that felt bigger than they were. But today, for reasons he couldn't explain, he said yes. They talked lightly, easily, and it felt nice. Simple, human. He didn't feel like he was losing time. He felt like he was gaining something he hadn't realized he was missing. Still, the shift was subtle, gentle, almost fragile. But later that afternoon, something unexpected happened, something that made the shift undeniable. Mark was about to leave the office when he overheard two co-workers struggling to carry a heavy box of supplies. Without thinking, he walked over and said, "Here, I'll help." He didn't plan it, didn't calculate the effort, didn't consider the time it might take. He just acted. And afterward, as trivial as the moment was, he felt the same warmth he'd felt the day before. A small act, an unexpected openness, a soft expansion inside, like a door quietly unlocking. He began to notice a pattern, the beginnings of a loop. Give, feel enough, open, connect, receive, want to give again. Of course, he didn't think of it in these words. His awareness was still forming, still waking up. But something inside him recognized it. Something ancient, something human. Generosity wasn't draining him, it was energizing him. It wasn't making him poorer, it was making him richer in a way he couldn't quite define. It wasn't about the coffee or the time or the effort. It was about the message he was sending himself. You are not as fragile as you believe. You do not need to live in fear. You have more space inside you than you thought. That day, as he walked home from work, the city felt different, not louder or brighter, just kinder. Or maybe he was the one who had changed. He passed by the same street where he'd given the coffee. The woman wasn't there anymore. Someone else occupied the spot now, a teenage boy with a sign made from torn cardboard. Mark didn't stop. Not this time. He wasn't ready for another act yet, but he did slow down. And he did feel the familiar spark of warmth, of recognition, of possibility. A small act had opened a door. And once a door opens, even just a crack light has a way of finding its way in. The loop was forming, quietly, naturally, unintentionally. And Mark was about to learn what generosity really creates, not loss, not risk, but space. A space where life can bring something new. There are moments in life that don't expand anything on the outside, but quietly expand something on the inside. Moments that create room, not in your schedule, not in your wallet, but in your being. Giving had started to create that room for Mark. A tiny widening, a soft unclenching, a loosening of something he'd held tight for too long. But it wasn't until 2 weeks later that he truly understood what that space meant. It began on an ordinary Thursday evening. Mark had stayed late at work to finish a report. The office lights were dim, the building almost empty. As he walked toward the elevators, he heard someone sniffling softly in the break room. Not crying loudly, just the quiet, fragile kind of crying that tries not to be heard. He hesitated. Old instincts kicked in. This isn't your business. Keep walking. Don't get involved. Protect your time. Protect yourself. But a new instinct, softer but rising, nudged him forward. He stepped into the break room. It was Emily, one of the newer analysts. She sat with her elbows on the table, face buried in her hands. Her shoulders trembled with each inhale. Mark didn't know Emily well. They'd spoken maybe twice, mostly about spreadsheets. He could have turned around. He could have pretended he didn't see anything. But instead he asked, quietly, "Hey, you okay?" Emily looked up, startled, wiping at her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "Sorry," she whispered. "I didn't think anyone was still here." It's all right," Mark said, sitting down across from her before he could overthink it. "What's going on?" She hesitated the way people do when they've been handling everything alone for far too long. Then everything came spilling out. Her father had fallen ill. Medical bills were stacking up. She was working overtime to cover what she could. She felt guilty being at work, but scared to miss a paycheck. She felt alone. Mark listened, really listened. Not just with the politeness of a co-worker, but with the presence of someone who actually cares, a presence he didn't know he had until recently. He didn't offer advice. He didn't try to fix anything. He simply gave her his attention, his time, his patience. An hour passed without him noticing. When the conversation finally slowed, Emily wiped her eyes again and whispered, "Thank you. I haven't talked to anyone about this. I just..."
I didn't have the space. Mark nodded, but inside he felt a subtle shock. Space.
That word hung in his mind like a small bell. He had given her space, the emotional kind, and in doing so he realized something. He had space to give. That internal spaciousness, the thing he thought he lacked his entire life, had begun to grow ever since he gave away that simple cup of coffee. And now it had grown enough to hold someone else's pain without fear, without shrinking, without the usual instinct to retreat. He walked home with a fuller understanding of something he'd only sensed before. Generosity isn't just the movement of money. It's the movement of presence, the movement of attention, the movement of self. And every time you give something anything from a place of sincerity, you create a pocket of spaciousness where fear once lived. That space changes things. The next morning, something happened that made the shift even clearer. As Mark stepped into the office, his manager approached him. "Hey," the manager said, "Emily told me you stayed late last night to help her out. That was good of you."
I didn't help, Mark replied. I just listened. That is helping, the manager said. More than you think. He walked away, but the words stayed with Mark. More than you think, because the ripple had already begun. Emily greeted him warmly when he reached his desk, a genuine connection forming from that one moment of presence. A co-worker from another team, overhearing the conversation, invited Mark to join their lunch group. That invitation led to a conversation about a small freelance project, something that would give Mark extra income for the month. None of this was dramatic. None of it was magical. None of it was destiny or cosmic reward. It was simply how life behaves when you stop tightening, stop clinging, stop shrinking. It moves toward you. Because generosity doesn't create debt. It creates space. And space is where new things can enter.
Mark didn't realize it yet, but he had just stepped into a deeper layer of the paradox. When you free a little space inside yourself, the world senses it, and it fills that space with connection, possibility, and ease. Fear compresses, generosity expands. That evening Mark found himself walking a little slower through the city, noticing things he usually ignored: the golden light reflecting off office windows, the laughter from a rooftop bar, the steady hum of traffic blending into a kind of urban lullaby. He felt part of the world, not separate from it. And in that quiet expansion, something surfaced, a truth so simple yet so counterintuitive that it almost felt like a secret. Giving doesn't deplete you, it unclutters you, it clears space for something better than fear. Mark didn't plan to change his life. He didn't set goals or intentions. He didn't tell himself he would be a more generous person. He simply followed the warmth, the feeling that rose whenever he opened instead of closed. Something had awakened in him. A small door, a crack of light, a growing spaciousness. And as that space grew, another realization began to emerge, one that would soon reveal the full paradox unfolding inside him. Generosity was not taking anything from him. It was giving him back a piece of himself. Most people think life changes in big moments: new jobs, new loves, sudden breakthroughs, unexpected tragedies. But sometimes life changes quietly, like a tide rising slowly, inch by inch, until one day you look down and realize the shoreline is completely different. That's what was happening to Mark. He didn't notice it at first. The shifts were too small, too gentle, too ordinary. But generosity has a strange way of rearranging the internal landscape long before the external world catches up. And one morning, as he was walking to work, He finally saw it.
A man in a navy suit bumped into him, spilling his own coffee and muttering under his breath. Normally, Mark would tense up, apologize quickly and hurry away, embarrassed and closed off. But something inside him was different. Before he even thought about it, he said, "Here, take mine." The man blinked. "Really?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, I'm good." The man accepted the cup, still confused, and walked away. Mark continued toward the subway, but he felt it again. That warmth, that internal expansion, that tiny pulse of enoughness. It struck him like a quiet revelation. Generosity was becoming his instinct, not a performance, not a moral choice, not even a conscious decision, but a reflex. And that was new. That was different. That was the loop revealing itself. The loop begins to show. By afternoon, the loop became impossible to ignore. He finished his tasks early, something he rarely managed before, and his manager stopped by his desk. "Got a minute?" she asked.
He followed her to a small meeting room. "I've noticed you lately," she said. "You seem more engaged, more collaborative. You're helping teammates. You're present." Mark didn't know what to say. He hadn't done any of this intentionally. "I'll want to put you on a small project," she continued, sliding a folder toward him. "It's not a promotion, but it's a step. It's more responsibility and more visibility." He blinked. A month ago she wouldn't have given him extra anything. Back then he stayed small, hidden, quiet, a reliable shadow. Generosity hadn't changed his resume, but it had changed the way he carried himself, and people could feel it. People respond to openness. They gravitate toward it. Fear closes you off. Generosity signals safety, and safety is magnetic. The loop wasn't mystical. It was behavioral, practical, human. But it felt mystical because of how seamlessly everything started aligning. That evening, when Mark left the office, the city felt brighter, not visually, but emotionally. The air felt lighter. People looked less like obstacles and more like participants, fellow humans in the same strange choreography of life. He was on his way to the subway when he heard someone call his name. It was Emily, the co-worker he had listened to 2 weeks earlier. "Hey," she said, smiling softly. "Just wanted to say things are getting a bit better. My dad's doing okay, and I'm managing." "That's good," Mark said sincerely. "And also," she added, "thank you again. That night helped me more than you know." He nodded, but inside he felt something click. Another loop, another return. Another small moment that reminded him that giving had changed something far beyond the one who received. It had changed him. The loop becomes a pattern. He saw it everywhere now, how one act opened the next. He gave time. Someone offered opportunity. He offered presence. Someone offered trust. He shared warmth. Someone shared connection. It wasn't transactional, it was relational, energetic, human. Life wasn't paying him back. It was responding to the version of him that generosity had activated. The paradox became clear. The more he gave from a place of enoughness, the more he lived like someone who already had enough. And people treat you based on who you appear to be, not who you fear you are. His world wasn't changing because he gave. It was changing because generosity shifted his identity from someone who clings to someone who trusts. And trust attracts things that fear never can. The aha moment. One night, while brushing his teeth, Mark caught his reflection in the mirror, tired but softer, grounded, calmer. There was something new in his eyes, not confidence, not pride, not superiority, just quiet. A calm he hadn't felt since childhood. A sense that maybe the world wasn't always a threat. Maybe he didn't have to defend himself from every moment, every possibility, every unknown. He turned off the bathroom light and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. That's when the realization came. Not loud, not dramatic, but honest. I've been living as if life was taking from me, but all this time I was the one holding everything back. He wasn't losing anything by giving. He was shedding the weight of fear, the heaviness he thought was normal, responsible, mature. And the moment he shed fear, space opened. And in that space, life moved toward him. Not with money, not with certainty, but with possibility. Mark lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling with a strange, gentle smile. Now he understood. The loop wasn't magic. The loop wasn't financial strategy. The loop wasn't about reward. It was about flow. Give, feel enough, open, receive, trust, give. Again. Scarcity had frozen him. Generosity unfroze him. And now the loop was no longer happening to him. He was choosing it. Life doesn't ask for grand gestures. It tests you in small, ordinary moments, the kind you can easily ignore if you're not paying attention. For Mark, that moment arrived on a windy Saturday afternoon. He was standing in line at a small bakery near his apartment, cradling a warm loaf of sourdough. He'd finally allowed himself to buy a tiny act of self-kindness he wouldn't have dared a month earlier. The door swung open, the bell chiming softly, and a young woman stepped inside holding a toddler on her hip. Her clothes were worn, her hair messy from the wind, and her voice trembling as she asked the cashier, "Do you have anything under $2? Her eyes darted around the shelves as though searching for something that didn't exist. The cashier shook his head softly. "I'm sorry. Not today." The woman nodded, trying to hide the disappointment as she whispered to her child, "Maybe next time, okay?" Mark felt his chest tighten. It wasn't the tightening of fear this time. It was the tightening of recognition, of memory,
of knowing exactly what scarcity feels like, not as a concept, not as a theory, but as a lived reality. The old Mark would have stayed quiet, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. If I give, I might not have enough later. The rules of his childhood would have risen like walls. But a different instinct rose now, one shaped not by fear, but by the loop that had been forming softly, naturally, patiently. He stepped forward. "You can take my loaf," he said gently, "please." The woman turned, startled. "No, no, that's yours. I can't." "It's okay," Mark said. "I'll get another." She hesitated, the way people do when they're not used to kindness, when they expect strings attached, when life has taught them caution. But then she accepted it slowly, gratefully, and whispered, "Thank you, really." Mark nodded and stepped out into the cold air. The wind wrapped around him. People walked past in hurried blurs. But he just stood there for a moment, breathing, letting the quiet warmth settle again, deeper this time, steadier, like a candle flame protected from the wind. He realized something simple but profound. He didn't feel smaller, he felt spacious, he felt free. Because the generosity wasn't about bread, it was about fear, and the fact that fear wasn't steering his life anymore. The return of the loop. Later that evening, as Mark sat at home with a fresh loaf of bread and a bowl of soup, his phone buzzed. It was his manager. "Call me when you can. Good news." His heart jumped, but not with fear, with curiosity. When he called, she told him the company had approved a budget for expanding his team's project, and he'd been selected to lead a small segment of it. It wasn't a promotion yet, but it was a step in a direction he'd never believed he could walk. And the timing
made him smile the kind of smile that comes from understanding something deeper than logic. Life wasn't rewarding him. It was meeting him where he finally stood open, not closed. The loop wasn't transactional. It wasn't karma. It wasn't cosmic bookkeeping. It was simply natural. When you stop gripping everything, your hands are free for something new. When you stop living in fear, people trust you. When you stop shrinking, life expands. Giving it changes posture, his energy, the way he showed up in the world. And the world responded, not because he deserved it, but because he was finally in a place where good things could reach him. Generosity had created space. Space had created confidence. Confidence had created connection. Connection had created opportunity. The loop was never about money. It was about movement. Fear freezes. Generosity flows. A final test. A few days later, the loop came full circle in a way that felt almost poetic. Mark received an unexpected check in the mail, a small refund from an overpayment he didn't even remember making. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was something extra. Something he didn't expect. Old Mark would have tucked it away immediately, just in case. New Mark paused. He thought about the woman in the bakery. He thought about Emily in the break room. He thought about the coffee cup on the cold sidewalk. He thought about the warmth that had been growing inside him like a secret garden. And he realized something. He was no longer scared of letting go. He was scared of going back to tightness, back to smallness, back to the cage. So he made a choice, not dramatic, not performative, not excessive. He donated the small amount to a local shelter, not because he wanted the loop to continue, but because he understood the truth now. The loop isn't something you create, it's something you step into. Generosity had changed him. Now he was simply acting in alignment with who he'd become. The closing realization. One night, sitting by the same window where this transformation began, Mark watched the city lights flicker like a constellation of tiny stories. He felt calm, deeply calm, for the first time in years. He wasn't rich, he wasn't fearless, he wasn't enlightened, but he was different. He understood something that scarcity had hidden from him for most of his life. What we keep out of fear, we lose. What we release out of trust returns to us in ways we never expect. He closed his eyes, let out a long, soft breath, and allowed the realization to settle like warm light inside his chest. And then, in the quiet of that moment, he whispered the truth that had been waiting since the beginning of this journey. Maybe wealth was never about money at all.